The first snow of December had begun to fall when Margaret opened her front door. Watching the white flakes drift across the quiet street of her small Portland neighborhood, the house behind her felt too big now still too full of echoes from a life that no longer existed. 3 years had passed since her husband Robert died, yet sometimes she still expected to hear his voice calling her name or the sound of his laughter rolling in from the living room. The silence now had weight. It pressed down on her shoulders every night when the clock struck 10. And the house went completely still. She was 72, with soft silver hair tied neatly at the back and eyes that carried both wisdom and sorrow. Her daughter Carolyn called often but rarely visited. She lived in Boston, caught up in meetings, clients, and the rush of city life. Margaret never complained. She understood the world had changed. But deep down, she longed for the sound of her daughter's footsteps in the hallway again, or for any voice at all that broke the loneliness that had settled in her heart. So, when Caroline called one cold Friday evening asking if her son Ethan could stay for the weekend while she was away for work, Margaret's heart lifted. She hadn't seen her grandson in almost 6 months. "Of course," she said immediately. "You know how much I love having him here." The next afternoon, she waited by the window as the taxi pulled up. The sight of Ethan stepping out with his little backpack, wearing a puffy jacket and that big grin that reminded her so much of Robert, made tears rise in her eyes. The moment he ran into her arms shouting, "Grandma!" the entire house seemed to breathe again. They spent the first evening baking cookies in the warm kitchen. Ethan loved adding too many chocolate chips, and Margaret didn't mind. Flour dusted their clothes. Laughter filled the room. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel like an old woman living alone. She felt alive again. Afterward, they played cards in the living room. And when he fell asleep on the couch, she covered him with a blanket and sat watching him, her heart swelling with quiet joy. The next morning, they walked to the park nearby. The air was crisp, and the trees were bare, their branches etched against the gray sky. Ethan ran ahead, chasing snowflakes, while Margaret walked slowly behind, her cane tapping softly on the ground. Watching him reminded her of Robert pushing Carolyn on the swing years ago. Time had moved forward, but in moments like this, it felt like it had circled back. When they returned home, Margaret made them hot chocolate. Ethan sat at the table, swinging his legs, eyes bright. "Grandma," he said suddenly, "do you ever get scared at night?" The question caught her off guard. She smiled softly. "Sometimes," she said, "but when I do, I think of your grandpa, and I don't feel so alone." Ethan tilted his head. "Mom says Grandpa's in heaven. Do you think he can see us from there?" Margaret looked out the window. The snow outside glowed under the soft afternoon light. "Yes," she said finally, "I believe he can." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, then said something that made her heart skip. "Then he must be happy you're not alone anymore." For a moment, she couldn't find words. His tone was calm, almost knowing. But what did he mean? Maybe it was just a child's imagination. Or maybe Margaret thought he had noticed something she didn't want to admit. She was lonely. She had been for a long time. That evening, after dinner, they sat by the fireplace. Ethan read from one of his favorite storybooks, and Margaret listened, smiling. When he finished, he looked up and asked, "Do you miss Grandpa a lot?" She nodded. "Every day," she said. "He was my best friend." Ethan reached over and took her hand. "Mom says love never ends. Maybe Grandpa's still here, just invisible." His innocence made her eyes fill with tears. "Maybe you're right," she whispered. When Ethan went to bed, Margaret stayed by the fire a little longer. The light flickered against Robert's old photograph on the mantel, him standing by their cabin by the lake, smiling as though time had stopped. She whispered softly, "Oh, Robert, if you can hear me, I hope you know how much I still miss you." It was past midnight when she finally turned off the lights and went to her room. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that used to make her uneasy, but this time something felt different, almost like someone was keeping her company. She closed her eyes, thinking of Robert, and drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, a sound woke her, a faint creak from the hallway. At first, she thought it was the wind. But then she heard soft footsteps, light and careful. She got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway light was on, and at the end stood Ethan, still in his pajamas. "Ethan," she said gently. "What are you doing up, sweetheart?" He turned toward her, his face calm but serious. "Grandma," he whispered. "I thought I heard Grandpa talking." Her breath caught. "Talking? What did he say?" Ethan looked down the hallway toward the living room, then back at her. He said, "Take care of her, Ethan." Margaret's heart thudded. She walked closer, knelt down, and touched his shoulder. "Maybe you were dreaming," she said softly. But her voice trembled. Ethan shook his head. It wasn't a dream. He sounded happy, like he was smiling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air in the hallway felt still, not cold, not warm, just peaceful. Then Ethan yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" She smiled faintly. "Of course." They went back to her room, and Ethan fell asleep almost instantly, his small hand resting over hers. But Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the old clock. Her mind spun with questions she couldn't answer. Could a child's imagination truly sound that real? Or was there something more, something she had been too closed off to feel until now? When she finally glanced at Robert's picture on her nightstand, something stirred inside her. The faint reflection of the hallway light glimmered over the glass. And for a second, she could almost imagine his eyes looking back at her. "Are you watching over us, my love?" she whispered. The clock ticked again. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and endless. And though she didn't hear any reply, a strange calm spread through her chest, the kind she hadn't felt in years. She closed her eyes, holding Ethan's hand. And this time, when sleep found her, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like company. For the first time since Robert's passing, she felt like the house wasn't mourning anymore. It was breathing again. Something unseen was there. Not haunting, but protecting. Watching Dot, and though she didn't know how or why, Margaret felt sure of one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of birds tapping against her bedroom window. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the world blanketed in white. She turned to find Ethan still sleeping beside her, his small face calm, lips parted slightly as he dreamed. For a moment, she watched him in the soft morning light. Remembering when Carolyn used to sleep the same way as a child, peaceful, trusting, full of life. But then the words from the night before returned to her mind. "Take care of her, Ethan." They echoed softly, unsettling, yet strangely comforting. She wanted to believe it had been just a dream, some innocent coincidence of imagination. But the way Ethan had said it, the calm in his voice, it didn't feel like something a child would make up. After breakfast, they went about their day as if nothing had happened. Margaret tried to keep her thoughts from wandering. She made pancakes. Ethan built a snowman in the front yard, and laughter filled the air again. But every now and then, she caught herself glancing at Robert's photograph on the mantel, wondering if his smile looked slightly different that morning, as though it held a secret. In the afternoon, they went for a walk around the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the trees heavy with snow. Ethan kept asking about his grandfather, what kind of man he was, what he liked to do. Margaret found herself telling stories she hadn't spoken out loud in years. She told him about the summer trips to their old cabin by the lake, how Robert loved to fish at dawn, how he would make her tea before sunrise and call her his morning song as she spoke. She realized her voice no longer trembled when she mentioned his name. It was as if speaking of him gave her strength. And when Ethan listened with wide, curious eyes, she felt like she was passing on something sacred, a part of Robert that would never fade. Later that evening, asked Grandma, "Do you still go to the cabin?" She smiled wistfully. "No, sweetheart. I haven't been there since your grandpa passed. It's too quiet now, too full of memories." He frowned. "But maybe that's why you should go back. Grandpa might be waiting there." Margaret blinked. "Waiting there?" Ethan nodded seriously. "He talked to me again last night. I didn't tell you because I thought you'd think I was making it up." But he said the cabin is special, that you'll understand when you go. Margaret's heart raced. Ethan, when did you hear that? He shrugged. Right before I fell asleep. His voice was soft, not scary. He just said, tell her to go back to where it all began. For a long time, Margaret didn't speak. The sound of the fire crackling was the only thing that broke the silence. She didn't know whether to dismiss it as imagination or take it as something deeper, a sign. But the thought of the cabin stirred something inside her, something she had buried long ago, that night. After Ethan went to bed, Margaret took out an old photo album from the shelf. The pages were yellowed, the corners worn. There, tucked between photographs of summer barbecues and lake sunsets, was a picture of the cabin. The sight of it made her chest tighten. She could almost smell the pine trees and hear the sound of the water brushing against the wooden dock. She traced the photo with her fingers, where it all began. She whispered, repeating the words Ethan had said. The cabin was where she and Robert had first met. It wasn't just a place, it was the beginning of their life together. She stayed awake late, thinking. Memories returned in flashes, their first kiss under the stars. The way Robert used to build fires while humming softly, the laughter that once filled those old wooden walls. Maybe going back wasn't such a strange idea after all. The next morning, she found Ethan sitting by the window, staring at the snow-covered yard. Grandma, he said quietly, do you think Grandpa can see us now? Yes, I do, she answered softly. And maybe he's trying to tell us something. He turned to her, his eyes bright. Then let's go to the cabin, please. Margaret hesitated, but something in his expression, that same mix of innocence and certainty, made her nod. All right, she said finally. We'll go tomorrow morning. That night, she packed a small bag, warm clothes, some food, and the old key she hadn't touched in years. She held it in her hand for a long time, remembering how Robert had given it to her when they first bought the place. Our forever key, he had called it. The following day, they drove out to the lake. The road was long and winding, cutting through the forest that grew thicker with every mile. The sun was low by the time they arrived, and the sight of the cabin made Margaret's breath catch. It looked exactly the same wooden porch, the same weathered door, even the same wind chime that Robert had hung years ago. Still swaying gently in the cold air, they stepped inside. Dust floated through the air, and the faint scent of pine lingered. Everything was still untouched, like time had been waiting for them. Margaret set her bag down and lit the fireplace. Slowly, the warmth began to spread through the cabin. Ethan wandered around, touching the furniture and pointing at old photographs. It feels nice here, he said, like it's alive. Margaret smiled faintly. It's full of memories. That's what you feel. They spent the evening making soup and telling stories. Ethan found Robert's old fishing hat and put it on, pretending to be him. I'm Grandpa, he said in a deep voice, making her laugh so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. But as night fell, the laughter faded into quiet reflection. Margaret sat by the fire alone while Ethan slept on the couch. The flames flickered, and she found herself speaking softly to the empty room. Robert, if you're really here, I'm listening. Tell me what I need to know. The room stayed silent. Only the wind moved outside. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. Maybe she had let her imagination run too far. Maybe this was just her heart's way of finding closure. Then, just as she began to doze off, she heard it, a faint sound, like a whisper carried on the air. Her name, Margaret. She froze. It was soft, warm, familiar. Her eyes darted toward the window, but no one was there. She looked at Robert's photograph on the mantel, and though the firelight made it hard to see clearly, she could have sworn his smile looked alive again. Tears filled her eyes. Robert, she whispered. Is it really you? The air in the cabin felt different, lighter, almost glowing. She closed her eyes and felt a calmness wash over her, one she hadn't known since he passed away. It wasn't fear she felt, it was peace. When she opened her eyes again, the room was quiet. The only sound was the crackle of fire. But something in her heart had changed. She no longer felt like she was chasing a memory. She felt like she was being guided by love, one that hadn't ended with death. As she looked toward Ethan, sleeping soundly by the fire, she smiled through her tears. Maybe Robert hadn't spoken to her directly, but his message was clear. She wasn't meant to be alone. She still had love to give and a family to share it with. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and endless. Margaret stood by the window, watching it dance under the moonlight. And for the first time in years, she whispered, not in sadness, but in gratitude, "Thank you, my love. I heard you." She turned back to the fire, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Warmth that came not from the flames, but from within. The next morning came quietly. The world outside the cabin was wrapped in white, the lake frozen still beneath a thin layer of snow. Margaret woke to the smell of smoke from the dying embers in the fireplace. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The wooden ceiling, the sound of the wind outside, it all felt like she had stepped into another time. One where Robert was still alive and laughter filled these rooms. Then she saw Ethan sleeping peacefully under a thick quilt, his tiny hand clutching Robert's old fishing hat. Her chest tightened, but this time it wasn't pain she felt, it was something deeper. Almost like gratitude. She rose slowly, her bones aching from the cold, and added a few logs to the fire. As the flames caught, warmth spread through the small cabin again. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the world wake up. It was quiet in a way that felt sacred. She had lived so long surrounded by noise phones, news, constant reminders of things that didn't matter. But here in this silence, she felt like she could finally hear what her heart had been trying to tell her all along. Ethan stirred awake and rubbed his eyes. "Morning, Grandma," he mumbled, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, smiling. "Did you sleep well?" He nodded. "Yeah, I had a dream again." Her heart skipped. About Grandpa. He looked at her, serious but calm. He said, "We did the right thing. That you found what you were supposed to find." Margaret's breath caught. What do you think he meant? Ethan thought for a second. Maybe he meant love. That you still have it. His words settled in her chest like a gentle truth. Love hadn't ended when Robert left, it had only changed its form. It had lived through her memories, through Ethan, through every quiet act of kindness she had carried forward in his name. After breakfast, Margaret and Ethan decided to walk down to the lake. The path was slippery, but Ethan insisted on going first, his small boots crunching in the snow. The air was sharp and cold, but clean and full of life. When they reached the shore, Margaret stopped. The lake stretched before them, frozen under a thin sheet of ice that glimmered in the morning sun. The view was breathtaking, beautiful, and still. Just like it had been years ago. "This is where your grandpa used to fish," she said softly. He loved the quiet. Said it helped him think. Ethan bent down to pick up a smooth stone from the ground. "Did you come here with him a lot?" "Almost every weekend," she replied with a small laugh. "He used to wake me up before sunrise, and I'd complain every single time. But when we got here, all I wanted to do was stay." They stood in silence for a while. Then, as if moved by something unseen, Margaret closed her eyes. She felt the wind brush against her face and whispered, "Robert, thank you." At that moment, she felt it again, the warmth, the presence. It wasn't a sound this time, not even a whisper. It was just a feeling, gentle but certain, like arms wrapping around her heart. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they weren't from sadness. They were from understanding. Ethan looked up at her, concerned. "Grandma, are you okay?" She smiled through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm more than okay." When they returned to the cabin, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. She looked around and saw the cabin not as a reminder of loss, but as a keeper of love, a place where memories lived, not ghosts. She knew it was time to stop running from the past and start living again. That evening, as the fire burned bright, Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, playing with a deck of old cards he had found in a drawer. "Grandma," he said suddenly, Can we come back here again? Maybe in the summer? She smiled, setting down her tea. I'd like that very much. He looked at her curiously. Do you think Grandpa will be here too? Margaret reached over and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. He'll always be here, she said softly, tapping his chest. Right in here. And in here, she added, touching her own heart. Love doesn't disappear when people do. It stays with us. Ethan nodded, his eyes wide, as if he truly understood. Then he leaned against her shoulder and whispered, I miss him, even though I didn't know him. She wrapped her arm around him. That's because he's part of you, and now part of me lives in you too. They sat like that for a long time, the firelight flickering across their faces. The night outside deepened, but inside, there was warmth of family, of memory, of love that refused to fade. Before bed, Margaret took one last look around the cabin. She ran her fingers over the wooden table, the old curtains, and finally over Robert's photograph. For years, she had avoided looking at that picture because it hurt too much. But tonight, it felt different. It didn't feel like saying goodbye. It felt like saying thank you. She whispered softly, You were right, my love. I wasn't alone. When they left the cabin the next morning, the sun had broken through the clouds. The air was crisp, the snow glistening like 1,000 diamonds. Margaret locked the door and held the key in her hand. She thought of leaving it there, letting the past rest, but then she slipped it into her coat pocket. Not to hold on to the past, but to remember that some beginnings never truly end. The drive home was peaceful. Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, and Margaret found herself humming one of Robert's old songs without realizing it. For the first time in years, her heart didn't ache, it felt full. When they reached home, Caroline was waiting by the door, her face lighting up when she saw them. Mom, you're back, she exclaimed, pulling Margaret into a hug. How was it? Did Ethan behave? Margaret smiled. He was wonderful. We had an unforgettable time. Ethan, half awake, mumbled Grandpa said hi. Caroline froze for a second, her eyes darting between them. What? Margaret placed a gentle hand on her daughter's arm. It's okay. He did. In his own way. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Margaret sat by her window, watching the moon rise. She took out the old key and held it in her palm. The metal was cold, but somehow comforting. She thought about how much had changed in just a few days. She had gone to the cabin to find closure, but what she found was renewal. Robert's love hadn't been haunting her. It had been guiding her, through the voice of a child, through the whispers of the wind, through the memories that refused to die. And now she understood what he had been trying to tell her all along. Life doesn't end with loss. It simply changes shape, waiting for us to see it again with open eyes. Margaret smiled, tears glistening on her cheeks, and whispered one last time, Thank you, my love. I'll carry you with me, always. Then she closed the curtains, turned off the light, and for the first time in years, fell into a deep, peaceful sleep outside. The wind rustled softly through the trees, and if anyone had been listening, they might have heard it too, a gentle voice carried on the air, whispering her name with love.